The First World War was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, claiming over 40 million military and civilian lives. The life of a trench soldier was an absolute living hell. They endured widespread diseases, constant hunger, swarms of rats, horrific odors, and the pervasive sight of countless dead bodies. And most importantly, they had to comprehend and then accept the harsh reality that death could claim them at any given moment. Today, we will explore what it really meant to be a soldier during World War I. From October 1914 to March 1918, British, French, German, Russian, and Ottoman troops fought in the trenches. While trenches offered soldiers shelter and crucial protection, they also, ironically, became the cause of countless deaths. When you hear about the trenches of the First World War, perhaps you picture a messy collection of crudely dug passages, but these pathways were actually laid out with strategic precision. The Entente and Central Powers designed their elaborate trench systems as a primary defensive mechanism. Heavy weaponry forced both sides to seek cover. Thus, trenches became a method to hold the line without making soldiers vulnerable. They were dug in zigzags and curves, creating angles and corridors that gave soldiers better views, additional vantage points, and essential cover. These zigzag patterns prevented the enemy from simply jumping into the trenches and wiping out all the defenders at once. All the trenches served different purposes. Some were for frontline troops, some for supplies, and others for storage. These days, people are paying good money to cover themselves with organic mud by visiting health resorts and to improve their skin's condition. However, during the First World War, prolonged exposure to the deep, boggy mud and water could lead to a condition known as trench foot. You could lose your toes, or even worse, an entire leg. Trench foot was so rampant and widespread that it affected a vast number of soldiers across all armies. Soldiers regularly inspected each other's feet. They were typically paired up, and each partner took on the responsibility for the other's foot health. Although medical science had advanced considerably, allowing for better monitoring of the health of World War I soldiers compared to all previous conflicts, it was still a common occurrence for soldiers to simply fall ill and perish. The cold, damp, and unsanitary conditions in the trenches did nothing to strengthen the soldiers. On the contrary, they made them highly susceptible to disease. Lice circulated throughout the trenches, spreading various diseases. It was not uncommon for soldiers to wake up and discover rats consuming their personal belongings or even gnawing on them. These rats were so incredibly bold that they would even bite sleeping soldiers. It's also important to remember that these very trenches became the breeding ground for one of the most lethal outbreaks of epidemics in history, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. The First World War was dramatically altered on April 22, 1915, when German forces shocked Allied soldiers on the Western Front by releasing more than 150 tons of deadly chlorine gas. The United States, which formally entered the First World War in 1917, also extensively developed and employed chemical weapons. Future President Harry Truman served as a captain of field artillery, which deployed poisonous gas against the Germans in 1918. In total, approximately 100,000 tons of chemical weapons were utilized during the First World War. The gas attacks were truly horrific. This represented a new level of warfare that no one had expected. A gas attack could cause serious injury or even death to anyone who was unlucky. Soldiers were not in the trenches 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months on end. In fact, soldiers actually spent only between 1 and 7 days in the trenches. A frequent rotation system was adopted. The rest of the time, they were given a period of rest. However, the word rest itself can be quite misleading. When regiments were understaffed, soldiers were typically assigned to the expansion and repair of trenches. Frontline soldiers, who were forced to confront death for days on end, naturally experienced devastating psychological effects and suffered severe mental trauma. The constant stress of trench warfare often led to extreme anxiety and debilitating panic attacks. Although medical military officials used terms like shell shock, we now call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Many soldiers who suffered from the disorder were sent home for recovery. Some soldiers, having suffered from shell shock, were brought before a court-martial and were even executed for various war crimes, including acts of abuse and charges of cowardice. Food in the trenches was an incredibly important thing during the First World War. Naturally, it was often quite terrible. The soldiers' diet typically consisted of boiled beef, bacon, vegetables, and bread. That might sound decent, but delivery could often take up to 8 days, and by the time the bread finally reached the front line trenches, it would already be completely spoiled. By the winter of 1916, flour was in such critically short supply that bread was actually made from dried, finely crushed turnips. It's likely that soldiers had to contend with truly awful food. But one thing they must have eagerly anticipated was the alcohol they were given, which provided them with the courage needed for the brutal trench warfare. Although millions perished, and it often felt like a new battle erupted daily, the lives of soldiers in the trenches frequently involved sitting idly, simply waiting for the next devastating artillery barrage. It seems impossible to be bored when surrounded by the enemy. But boredom was the most common condition, so the British military found a creative way to boost morale. A trench magazine was produced. British soldiers stationed near Ypres in Belgium found an old typewriter and put it to good use, publishing their own magazine and distributing it in the trenches. It was full of dark humor, but at times touching. And although as horrific as World War I was, the first Christmas of that war in 1914 showed a spirit of humanity and unity that contrasted sharply with life in the trenches. On Christmas Eve, singing from the British and German trenches led to a preliminary truce for the holiday. Soldiers from opposing sides emerged from the trenches and met on no man's land, drinking together and exchanging gifts. Unfortunately, the peace didn't last long. Fighting resumed the next day, and goodwill once again turned to hostility. Subscribe to the channel, like it, and leave your comments.